In 2022, Canada and Australia had one thing in common: the median house price. But fast forward 3 years and Canada's house prices are crashing whilst Australia's housing bubble keeps getting worse. First it was New Zealand to see house prices smashed. Now it's Canada, so will Australia be next? Today I'm going to check out this article from The Guardian, look at what's happening to the Canadian housing market, and consider the probabilities of the same thing happening in Australia. One thing about Canada and Australia is that they've both turned their housing markets into a speculative casino. And by that I mean they've incentivized property speculation for the sole purpose of creating wealth. This has led to a massive housing bubble developing in both countries. And I say housing bubble because house prices in Canada and Australia hasn't just risen modestly, sort of in line with wages or inflation. House prices in both countries has grossly outperformed wages, meaning that housing affordability has deteriorated year after year. Now, if you look at this chart of real house prices, meaning they've been adjusted for inflation, you can see that Australia and Canada have massively outperformed other developed nations. And if New Zealand was on the chart, it would also definitely be up there. At the start of 2022, after the COVID stimulus-fueled housing boom, the typical house in Australia and Canada was worth $840,000 in each equivalent currency. But after that, house prices soon diverged, with Australian city prices climbing by about $85,000, whilst Canadian prices have crashed by around $150,000. This makes the typical Canadian home now 20% cheaper than those in Australia. Now, when I compare New Zealand house prices with Australia's, everyone says that their economy is different to ours, but the argument could be made that the Canadian economy is a lot more aligned to Australia's. So because both countries are economically aligned and also face similar housing bubbles, will Australia see a popping of its housing bubble similar to what seems to be occurring in Canada? When you've got the most speculative housing markets in the world and you flood the entire economy with massive stimulus while at the same time reduce interest rates to zero, well, that's just going to send house prices through the freaking roof. And that's what happened after COVID in both countries. According to this article, by early 2022, Sydney had surged 250,000 to reach 1.2 million, while Toronto had surged 400,000 to reach a peak of 1.3 million. Now, I'm assuming that these median prices are a combination of houses and units. And that's because if you're just looking at houses, Sydney at that stage was way higher than 1.2 million and currently is sitting around 1.6 or 1.7 million just for the median home. If we look at house prices in both of those major cities since 2019, we can see that after the COVID inflated boom, once interest rates started rising, both cities saw house price declines. But the difference is, in 2023, when Sydney prices started rising again, they've kept on rising and they've now hit new all-time highs. Compare that with Toronto, whose house prices have stayed relatively flat and recently have actually drifted lower. Now, this seems to be a consistent story with Australia. Every time there's the possibility of house price declines, it seems like the government and the RBA come to the rescue and do everything they can to support house prices, which means that any corrections are usually short-lived and rebounds are extremely fast. We've seen housing demand significantly fall in New Zealand. It's now falling in Canada. Extremely speculative markets like China and Hong Kong have also seen reduced demand recently. Is Australia now the only country left that prioritizes ultra-high house prices above everything else? Shockingly, it's bloody well starting to look that way. Now, the Toronto housing crash isn't just a beat up by the media. The housing market has seen a shocking slump in demand and house price falls, which many are calling a crash. Now, I know they have a lot of condos over there, and that could be playing a factor, but just a quick search immediately reveals that the Toronto housing market has turned from a seller's market when it was at its peak to now an actual buyer's market. And just like New Zealand, who also have a buyer's market, Australian home buyers would be absolutely envious. In Australia, housing demand is so out of control, it seems like you wait a couple of weeks and house prices have risen another $50,000. It's insane, the demand in Australia. But in Toronto, you've got investors who paid $1 million at the peak, now having that same property only worth around $700,000. They're seeing a lot of landlords panic because they're faced with a mega loss. What a contradiction to Australia, where landlords always win. But maybe landlords' golden run in Australia, just like New Zealand and Canada, could be coming to an end. Would Australian policymakers even allow house prices to fall like they have in our neighbouring countries? Sadly, based on past experience, there's more chance that hell would freeze over than Australian house prices be allowed to fall. If we look at interest rates across both countries, just like New Zealand, Canada went ultra hard when they hiked rates. You can see an extremely sharp rise, taking their cash rate all the way to 5%, which really would have broken the back of housing speculation. Australia was slower and more measured when they raised rates, and they only went to a peak of 4.35%. But as you can see from this graph, Canada has dropped their cash rate much faster and is now well below Australia. Now this is extremely telling. Canada has a much lower cash rate but still is seeing a very sluggish housing market, while Australia still has restrictive interest rates but continues to see mass demand. This is a complete failure for Australia in my opinion, because they've amped up housing demand for so many years now that nothing seems to be able to curb this insatiable demand. Now there's two main reasons that I believe Canadian house prices have been falling. First, after surging their population, they admitted they went too hard and put in strict new policies to curb inflation and basically flatline them for the next few years. Now Australia also surged their population, but there's been no drastic attempt to significantly cut migration levels to ease the housing crisis. An example of this is Australia's international student cap, which for 2026 has been increased by 25,000. The thing that I can't get my head around is that Australia has one of the worst rental vacancies out of every developed world. We're currently sitting with a rental vacancy rate just over 1%, which is basically crisis levels. I mean, the US has a rental vacancy rate around 7% currently, and Canada's vacancy rate has now climbed to around 4.1%. So Australia, with a shockingly terrible rental vacancy rate, is still pursuing mass migration levels. It's really bewildering and also extremely sad at the same time. Secondly, Canada's economy is really struggling and unemployment is surging. The number of unemployed Canadians has reached 1.6 million and their unemployment rate has climbed to 7%, which is up from 5% in early 2023. Now, a high unemployment level definitely impacts the housing market, because if you don't have a job, you can't buy a home, and that takes many people out of the running, which reduces overall demand. On top of that, it increases forced sales, because if you've got a large mortgage and you lose your job, you may not be able to hold on to that home. But even if you can hold on, it reduces overall investor demand, because if you don't have a job, you're definitely not going to buy an investment property. But also, if you're worried about your job and you're worried about your future job prospects, you're also probably not going to make a major investment. So all this combined significantly reduces housing demand, which is what seems to have happened in Canada. Now, Australia has seen a small rise in their unemployment levels, taking them to 4.3%, but this is much lower than Canada. On the surface, that could look like Australia's doing much better than Canada, but when you look a bit closely, it may not be as good as it seems. You see, private sector job creation has collapsed, and analysis shows that 82% of all jobs created in the past 2 years were government-funded positions. So in Australia, new government-funded positions definitely seems to be playing a part in helping to keep unemployment levels very low. But if this was to change at the same time while private sector jobs continued to collapse, Australia could easily see surging unemployment levels. Out of the three most speculative housing markets in the developed world, we've seen the housing bubble pop in both New Zealand and Canada. Shockingly, Australia's bubble is still intact, but its days could be numbered.